Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Sabrine Kadumi, and I would like to welcome you to the second annual Georgi Danis Eastern Mediterranean Security and Diplomacy Seminar. The Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies, in cooperation with the Constantine G. Carmenellis Chair in Hellenic and European Studies, the American College of Greece, the Institute of International Relations of Pantheon University, and the Department of International Relations and European Integration of the National University of Political Studies and Public Administration in Romania. We'll be hosting a one-week program focusing focused lectures, presentations, and panel discussions. The one-week program will bring experts from different regions in 3 sets of presentations and panel discussions daily aimed at assessing the energy and climate challenges in the dynamic Eastern Mediterranean and neighboring regions. Our presenters this week will come from different countries of the region, as well as backgrounds. We have a mixture of policymakers, diplomats, and academics. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our facilitator, Dr. Yuli, who is an assistant teaching professor in the International Affairs program at Northeastern University. She holds a bachelor's in political science from Wellesley College, a master's in public policy with concentration in international security policy from Harvard Kennedy School, and a PhD in political science from Northeastern University, and teaches classes in globalization, international affairs, and international conflict. We also have our speaker, who is Dr. Vasilia Didiki, which will be introduced by Dr. Yuli. Before turning the microphone to our speaker, I would like to let you all know that I will act as the host of the event and will guide the Q&A, which will follow the 30 to 45-minute presentation. The duration of our program will be 1 hour and 30 minutes. I would like to ask you to turn off your microphones and use either chat or to raise your hand for question. We'll try to answer all questions. It is nice to have you all here and hope that we have a productive presentation and discussion. I will pass the floor now to Dr. Yuli.
Thank you for the invitation to participate in this seminar. It's my honor, and it's also my honor to be introducing Dr. Digidiki. It is always a pleasure to join one of your talks. So Dr. Digidiki is an instructor at Harvard University, a health and human rights fellow at the Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights, and the director of the Harvard FXB Summer Program on Migration. She is a forensic and social psychologist and leads the Harvard FXB Center's research agenda on migration and child protection. Since 2014, Dr. Digidiki has studied child protection and child trafficking amidst the humanitarian crisis, the sexual exploitation of migrant children, the impact of repatriation on children and youth, and strategies for increasing resilience and agency among stranded migrant children. Her latest studies have focused on Greece, Bangladesh, West and Central Africa, Sudan, and Mexico. Prior to joining the Harvard FXB Center in 2014, Dr. Digidiki worked extensively on public perceptions of human trafficking and victim blaming. She holds a PhD in clinical and social psychology and 2 master's degrees on forensic and social psychology. So it is our pleasure to listen to the lecture prepared by Dr. Digidiki.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this introduction, Professor Diamandikaranu. Before I start, I'd like to wish everyone a happy new year full of health and joy and less pain. And, you know, at a time when the COVID-19 pandemic continues to threaten our planet, when war or the threat of war lurks around every corner, when millions of people are forcibly displaced, when geopolitical dynamics in Southeastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Eastern Mediterranean pose a very real threat to the security and prosperity of their people, wishes for peace and health take on a whole new meaning. So let's hope that this year brings with it at least a fragment of the healing we need as humans. And I would also like to thank you, Professor Vavakas, for the invitation to participate in such an important seminar. It is a great pleasure for me to be here today and for the opportunity to discuss how the phenomenon of migration, and particularly irregular migration, unfolds in the Eastern Mediterranean and how it evolves in a continuously changing policy environment. And as it was mentioned before, for the past 10 years, I have studied refugee rights and the intersection between human trafficking and forced displacement during different humanitarian crises across the world. However, the migration crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Greece specifically is of unique interest to me, both scientifically and personally, as I have experienced it, studied it, and witnessed it from three different angles: that of the researcher, the first responder, and the local, as I'm a native of the island of Lesbos. That small Greek island that not only has seen more than 500,000 migrants crossing through since 2015, but also the island that has become the testing ground for new successful or unsuccessful European migration policies to halt the flows. And this unique perspective further drove my research interest in understanding the impact of the influx of migrants on frontline host communities in the Mediterranean and beyond, and those factors that can lead to xenophobia and the destruction of humanitarian empathy. So today I will try to bring on the table the experience from the ground. And in the time that I have, I would like to raise two main points very relevant to the phenomenon of migration and its attempted solutions in the region. The first point has to do with the reasons driving irregular migration in the region and the interface of migration and human trafficking. And the second point, with the reasons behind the unsuccessful effort to include and integrate distressed migrants into local societies. And I do hope that these points will give you some food for thought and some additional perspectives to consider when discussing about distressed migration in the region and inclusive solutions. But let's start by talking about migration as a phenomenon in general. Human mobility is not a new phenomenon. It is a dynamic, well-established phenomenon with a long history. People have always been moving within or outside their countries, pursuing opportunities or seeking safety. Now, of course, human mobility can present both risks and opportunities. Because migration is considered value neutral as a phenomenon, it is the circumstances of the journey that will define whether this mobility will be positive or negative for people, problematic or unproblematic. And you know, for a significant number of people, migration is considered as a very positive experience because there is an established global mobility structure that makes human mobility possible and easy. But accessing this global mobility structure, by accessing this, migrants are able to arrive in a new place, go through a period of adjustment, and then integrate into their new societies, accessing the rights they're entitled to. But what is happening when access to this global mobility infrastructure is limited? What is happening when people who are forced to move do not have access to this infrastructure? Then human mobility becomes problematic. It becomes unsafe, risky, exploitative, with devastating and even fatal consequences for those on the move, and particularly for vulnerable groups such as women and children. Forced migration, migration that is fueled by a wide range of drivers that are perceived as intolerable, such as natural and environmental disasters, economic deprivation, persecution, or gender and social oppression, is not a new phenomenon either. But before, forced migration was not widespread and was considered a rather short-term and temporary phenomenon. Nowadays, we witness a changed reality. Forced migration is large-scale, vastly more widespread, and it is long-term. And let me provide some numbers. In 2017, 68.5 million people were forced to migrate within or outside their borders, more than any point in human history. And of course, it is not just important to understand the number of forcibly displaced people, but also how fast this number has grown. At the moment, 1% of the world's population, or 1 in 97 people, is forcibly displaced. This compares with 1 in 159 people in 2010 and 1 in 174 people in 2005, numbers that indicate a rapid growth in the number of people fleeing their homes. And of course, several major crises contributed to this change reality. The list is long, but I want to mention some of them that mostly contributed to the mass influx of migrants in the Mediterranean region since 2015. The outbreak of the Syrian conflict, the renewed conflict and security concerns in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Somalia, the conflict in the Central African Republic, the renewed outbreaks of fighting and violence in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it is important to note here that though the majority of the displacement globally is the result of conflicts and persecutions, it becomes obvious that a significant number of people are forcibly displaced because of sudden onset weather events, such as flooding, forest fires after droughts, and intensified storms, or because of the deteriorating living conditions caused by climate change. And it is expected that climate change will soon become a significant push factor in human migration patterns globally. And to put you in perspective, in 2018, the World Bank estimated that by 2050, 3 regions, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, will generate 143 million climate migrants. But let's focus now on the Mediterranean region. What we observed since 2015 in the Eastern Mediterranean region is a clear example of distress migration. More than 1,100,000 distress migrants entering Greece by way of Turkey, and more than 500,000 entering Italy by way of Libya. A very heterogeneous group of distress migrants of all ages and genders, fleeing different humanitarian crises, but seeking the same thing: protection and a better life. Now, this increased influx mistakenly cultivated the notion of a migration crisis in the public discourse, emphasizing that these massive influxes were a surprising, unexpected, and unpredictable event that will be short-term with a hard end date. And in this context, both the political and public discourse focused mainly on 2 major things: the deadly risks that migrants face during their journey, and the threat that this influx and crisis will pose on Europe's external borders that turned from transit to destination countries. It never questioned whether this influx is a foreseeable response to cycles and structures of violence in origin countries, and the structural failures of the global migration system. And because of the structural failures of the global migration system and the limitations of the international refugee law, forced migration comes with a cost, particularly evident in the case of distressed migrant women and children. Why? Because as the mismatch between the supply of legal migration opportunities and the demand for mobility is vast, the majority of distressed migrants opt to migrate irregularly, even though they know that the Mediterranean is the world's deadliest migration route. They are forced to enter the so-called human mobility business and rely on profit-driven mobility mediators that are situated somewhere on the smuggler-trafficker continuum and most often move from one point to another during the migration journey. And as you understand, in this case, distressed migrants are pushed into situations where price rather than protection defines their prospects. And according to data, the mismatch between available legal opportunities and need for migration have forced more than 90% of the distressed migrants arriving in Europe to rely on organized criminal networks for their mobility. But instead of addressing this mismatch and ensuring that distressed migrants whose only option at the moment are suffering or displacement have a way to migrate regularly, many European countries opted to adopt some rather superficial solutions: stricter border controls and unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral state agreements with third countries that are framed as a life-saving humanitarian endeavor, and as a way of cracking down on smuggling and trafficking crime syndicates. The result, flows to Eastern Mediterranean, as we witnessed them in 2015, were reduced, but migrants' mobility was not halted. Flows were diverted to different, more dangerous routes, went underground, and the cost of mobility was increased. And to give you an example, now more and more migrants are being packed inside unsafe large boats and are sent from the Turkish coast to Italy. And for those of you who know the region and have the map of Greece in mind, this new route means that migrants have to cross the Aegean Sea, pass the peninsula of Peloponnese, cross the Ionian Sea, and then reach Italy. And as you understand, the risk of exploitation of any kind becomes higher, the risk of death is higher, while thousands of distressed migrants are stranded in third, often unsafe countries, or countries with limited capacity to protect them. And of course, these measures have generated chaos on many countries of the region that were forced to become Europe's de facto southern border police, a situation that has serious consequences for both migrants in need, but also for local communities. And this is the first point I would like to raise. These solutions are doomed to fail because they ignore the reasons why distressed migrants flee. Stricter border controls and high walls can for sure complicate the trajectories of distressed migrants, but they do not stop them. They just give the impression of control over the situation, but do not resolve it with respect to human rights. And to bring up a domestic example, despite the 654-mile physical barrier between the US and Mexico, almost 1 million distressed migrants arrived at the US border in 2019. Now, the answer to the current situation is to address two of the key underlying problems. First, the factors that drive thousands to flee their home countries. And second, the lack of effective policies and interventions to manage humanitarian migration. To give you an example, in response to lengthy asylum procedures, the new European Commission's plan calls for faster pre-entry screening and quick returns of those who fail to qualify for asylum. Initially, this may sound as a very good approach in response to prolonged delays, but in reality, faster pre-entry screenings can deny asylum seekers a thorough review of the merits of their claims and result in unfounded rejections. At the moment, whoever is arriving at the Greek islands is being processed within the first 7 days. And colleagues on the ground say that many vulnerable categories of asylum seekers, such as victims of torture, do not have time to go through the necessary medical procedures to support their claim. And after the first rejection, they have 30 days to appeal the decision, which is still not enough time to collect the necessary evidence in a place that lack the necessary services. So these are rather unrealistic requirements, leading to rejections of people who are eligible for international protection. And let's not forget that we still don't have a multilateral strategy or a legal framework to account for climate change as a driver of migration. Only when an adverse climate event coincides with armed conflict and violence, people displaced due to climate change may have a valid claim for refugee status. And we all understand that these problems are not easy to fix. They need time, willingness, and coordination in multiple levels, and they are certainly not the responsibility of one country or one region. And we need to start by understanding that large-scale forced migration is not one-off crisis. It is not a crisis that will end, because the problem is not really the numbers, but the way we see migration. We need to realize that large-scale migration is a rather permanent and open-ended phenomenon, and we need to enable it in an ethical and just way. And as the situation in many parts of the world illustrates, the costs of ignoring this are unsustainable in human, economic, and political terms. So now, moving from distressed migrants who attempt to enter to those who manage to enter Europe and apply for asylum, my second point has to do with efforts of inclusion of migrants in local communities. Since the beginning of the migration crisis in Europe, inclusion and integration of asylum seekers in the countries of the region has turned into a key component of interventions. Governments introduce measures to ensure that asylum seekers have access to basic services such as school, housing, health services, and jobs. However, the inclusion and integration of migrants is hardly as straightforward as it sounds. Most of the times, it is perceived as a one-way process. Migrants have to assimilate by abandoning their culture and belief systems in favor of the culture of the local population. Or, as we have increasingly seen happening, the full responsibility to care for migrants or placed on small local communities, anticipating and almost demanding that local communities continue their initial welcoming and generous disposition regardless of conditions on the ground. But integration is a two-way inclusion process that depends on both the efforts of the migrant community and the openness, willingness, and preparation of the host community. So for the process to succeed, integration should be desirable from both sides and should consider the needs of both sides. What we witness in practice in the region is that asylum seekers lag far behind the local population across a broad swath of quality of life indicators, while the needs and concerns of the local communities are completely ignored in this process. And let's use the example of Greece again to make this more clear. Since 2015, and under the pressure of the influx and that of Europe for a quick resolution of the crisis, even though the country did not have the capacity to do so, most inclusion efforts tended to focus on speed and numbers, aiming to integrate large number of migrants as fast as possible. For example, the Greek government tried to integrate 19,000 migrant children in just 1 year in the Greek public education system, without preparing the local communities, teachers, students, and parents. Asylum seekers were given access to public health resources without ensuring whether these resources were adequate for both migrants and locals. For example, the island of Lesbos, with a local population of 97,000 people, has one hospital with 7 ICU beds, a resource that for a long time was shared with additional 10,000 migrants that were stranded on the island. And in this process, the local population remains unprepared to accept the new institutional arrangements to accommodate migrants' social and cultural needs. The local community, a homogeneous in terms of culture, religion, and identity community, was asked to share their space and resources with a heterogeneous group in terms of culture and religion, without the needed time and preparation that such an integration requires. And what is the outcome? The local population perceives the migrant population as a threat or a problem, and efforts of integration fail. And we have seen this happening in EU member states once removed from the migration front line. And to use again the example of Greece, what we are seeing in Greece is a very public transition from an open, welcoming community that exhibited unique solidarity and compassion towards the migrant population to one that now begins to show signs of exhaustion and fatigue that hurt the initial emblematic generosity, leading to hostility, xenophobia, and rejection, and hindering efforts of inclusion. And this is more noticeable in smaller communities with large concentration of migrants in need. And this is my second point. Integration is a two-way process that entails that both migrants and locals not just influence the process, but become an important part of the process. Efforts in the region ignored the local community and did not take into account the multifaceted ways that the community's past and present history and experiences shape and drive their perceptions towards such a heterogeneous group of incomers. They ignored that in the aftermath of the recent financial crisis and austerity, migrants will be conceptualized as competitors for the existing limited public resources. They ignored that for a homogeneous nation with a long history of attacks to its freedom, culture, religion, and identity, a significantly large group of migrants with a different culture and religion may be perceived as a threat to their homogeneity without the proper preparation and time. And you know, this creates a vicious cycle. The more people feel a sense of threat or a loss of control, the more attached they become to ethnic and national identities, rejecting anything that is different. Thus, when we talk about successful inclusion and integration, we should remember that it is a relational process in which migrants and locals integrate with each other and in which history and experiences matter. And I just want to close here with a reflection. The political conflicts over migration and refugees, both in the US and the Eastern Mediterranean, share a critical similarity. They aim to deter people from attempting unauthorized border crossings in the first place. In many regions, the increased mobility has inevitably led us to talk about migration of nations rather than migration of individuals. But still, protections long embedded in international law have been eclipsed by an exclusionary migration agenda. And the phrase out of sight, out of mind captures widely the current underlying political intent in the global north. We are facing a crisis of humanitarian ideas, a crisis of trust and solidarity, a crisis that requires a radical departure from our current trajectory if we want to remain faithful to our core values. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, please submit them in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Degideki, for this really excellent presentation on the implications of the refugee crisis in our region. It was very insightful, and it is very important that we bring together, as you also did in your presentation, lessons from theory, but also from practice, and we try to improve policies. There are a few points I would like to stress that I found to be particularly important in your presentation. One is the overall approach to the problem from a humans first perspective, the humanization of the migration problem, which is really something that we don't see as often as the politicization of the refugee issue, as a securitization of migration in general. So we do need to remember that first and foremost, this is indeed a human problem, a problem of human security, and we need to keep that in mind. In addition, I wanted to stress the point that you made in the beginning that I think is quite important. In our globalized world, we tend to talk about the lack of importance of borders, that borders are fading away and so on. And you stress the kind of dual role that borders have today. So for some people, borders indeed fade away and mobility is easy. But for others, as we see in this whole discussion on refugees, borders still are very much real, and even new walls of any kind are being erected to prevent mobility. So it looks like it depends on who you are and where you're coming from, whether the borders have indeed started to fade or whether even new obstacles to mobility are being raised for you. The other important point that you stressed has to do with identifying the underlying factors of the refugee problem and migration problems in general. With any policy problem, public policy problem, unless we do identify the causes and unless we act at that level, the causal level, we are going to keep coming up with solutions that are very superficial, that address the results, the symptoms of the problem, and we will not be able to really do away with the problem in the first place. So we need to expand our frame through which we look at the problem. We tend to look at migration, illegal migration, irregular migration, refugee flows through a very limited lens, a very limited frame that only looks at the border. The same along the borders of Greece, the same across the US border in Mexico. But we need to expand our frame and look at the bigger picture and look at the problems that push these people away from their original countries, because no one risks their life for fun and the life of their kids. So they are fleeing from life-threatening conditions. And unless we work at that level to address these underlying factors that push them away from their countries of origin, we will keep dealing with even possibly more massive flows of refugees in the future. And we do anticipate, as you very correctly pointed out, the increasing problems associated with climate change and the creation of more and more flows of climate refugees in the future. We know that this is coming, and this is also something that we can start to address in terms of fixing the conditions on the ground in these places in order to prevent these future flows and the human suffering that will come with it. We also need to remember that being a refugee is really kind of a condition. It's not a label. It's not kind of an identification that you have. We are not currently refugees, but many of our ancestors, being Greek, also were refugees at a certain time. So we also need to shy away from assigning labels to groups of people from certain regions of the world, because the conditions that were present at certain historical times and in certain regions make people go into this role of being a refugee. And of course, it is a forced condition that people do not choose voluntarily. The last couple of points I want to make are to stress your emphasis on the problems associated with policymaking, the gaps in the existing policies, but also problems with implementation of these policies. And it looks like research coming from all different perspectives, all different disciplines, would very much inform these policies to prevent problems that we see today. And not only quantitative type of research, but also qualitative that deals with the issues that you mentioned in terms of the local culture and so on. And hopefully your research also will help in that respect to improve policies. Definitely the emphasis on the local communities and this two-way interaction between locals and refugees, migrants is really important, and it is something that is missing from how we think about policymaking, how we think about problem solving with respect to the particular issue. And of course, this creates more problems because as you explained, there are a lot of implications for the local population, and we need to support the local population in order to enable it to support these flows of people in their midst. And if we think especially of developing countries, but we can also think, as you mentioned, of Greece at the time of economic crisis, when you have such an inflow of a massive flow of people, and you are dealing with an economic crisis and problems with your infrastructure and the delivery of your basic services, of course, it is becoming quite problematic to support both the locals and the refugees and migrants. And if we think about developing countries, and we have in the greater region a lot of developing countries that are in a much worse situation compared to Greece in terms of their delivery of services and basic infrastructure, then we see that when they have to host refugees, and in some cases in the region, we're talking about millions of refugees, and you already are starting with a system that is not working properly, even for the locals, the situation can really be explosive. Just to end, I hopefully on a positive note, I think also from your experiences and your work, and in general also from hearing stories of refugees and migrants, as well as volunteers who work in this field, it is really inspiring to hear in the midst of all the problems, all the risks, the dangers, the tensions, to hear the stories of hope and resilience that these refugees bring, and also the stories of empathy and loving relationships that have been created between volunteers and refugees. Human bonds that continue in many cases even after these refugees leave those organizations that offer them support. So these were just a few remarks on your presentation, and looking forward to the discussion with the questions.
I mean, if I could interject here, I was just thinking, both comments, both, Vasily and Yuli making very good comments here. And, I mean, from a psychological perspective, I think it's almost like a constant fear for all of us that we're like a step away from being refugees ourselves. So, I mean, how much of that is driven, Yuli just mentioned the fact that, ancestors, refugees. I think we all in a liberal marketplace, in a liberal world where everybody's a commodity, it just seems like there's a fear of constant displacement, even for the people that are there. So like how much of that goes into, some of your research, Vasily, like as far as, the psychological effects. I mean, I just saw the census of Bulgaria that was published yesterday. I don't know if people have seen that, but Bulgaria's population went down by 11% in a decade. There's 6.5 million people now in Bulgaria from like 7.3 or whatever they were a decade ago. So you have like this constant movement of people and people who are just trying to hold on. And then you have this constant displacement. How much of that is, goes into even the sort of like nationalist reaction? Is there a way, are there studies on that?
So this is a very interesting point, and it takes us really back to the global infrastructure for mobility. Yes, people are moving within and across borders. We have seen it in Greece, we have seen it in the broader region. People are moving to find better opportunities. Some of us are more lucky and we move just to find a better life or a bigger salary. Others are moving to find safety and less bombs over their heads. So yes, in this sense, I would say that we're just lucky where we're born and what kind of opportunities we have. But before I give an answer to your question, I want to go back to the comment of Yuli, the very initial one. Yes, it depends where you are and where you're born and your nationality, whether you're going to face borders or not in your life. And it's not just your nationality, but also your gender and your socioeconomic status. We know very well that for many people to access visas to go to specific countries, they need to show specific savings, they need to show their bank accounts, they need to get permission from their parents or from their protectors. So we find more and more reasons why people face borders in their movement. So now what we don't see, and I will phrase it differently, what we see right now is that still people continue to see refugees as illegal migrants rather than refugees and rather than as human beings, because they don't really understand how the global infrastructure of mobility works. They don't really understand why people cannot move legally. I have heard it many times during discussions that I had with people, either in the context of research or in the context of friendly discussions from immigrants here in the US saying, we came legally. Why they cannot enter the other countries legally and they have to enter illegally. And this is the main point that leads perceptions against refugees. They don't really understand why they have to travel illegally, why they're forced to travel illegally. And we see also this, in the way the governments try to deal with these illegal flows, they put the responsibility on the criminal networks. They just don't really understand that the criminal networks facilitate this. No criminal network will go to someone and say, I will move you without you wanting it. So if we don't address the reasons why they move and the way they move, we will continue facing the same situation. People really are driven by their perception around illegal immigration and security and national sovereignty, and they don't really understand what it means not to have the possibility to migrate regularly. I'm sure that if they have the option to migrate regularly, they would. And there is a very famous poem, for those of you who don't know it, it is called Home, and it is written by a Somalian British refugee that said that no one is putting their kids in a boat if the water is safer than the land. So I think this says everything. So.
That was really great. We have one question in the Q&A. It is, given the deepening of the economic/political crisis in the EU, how will be developed the European migration/integration policies?
This is a very good question. As I mentioned at the moment, the countries of the global north face a crisis of values. We are facing a crisis of us not being able to follow what we promised to do towards vulnerable populations. Yes, we are facing a political crisis, and we are seeing that countries cannot agree on how to deal with a migration crisis. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, this is not a problem that can be resolved by one country alone or by one region alone. So we need to have collaboration. I think that we just need to redefine what migration is and what is forced migration is. And this is not an issue in economical terms. If someone considers how much money the European Union has put in creating detentions, in detention centers, in creating camps, in designing the hotspots. If all this money was going into the societies, creating new jobs, and use the abilities and capabilities of the migrants and refugees to give back to the society, we wouldn't talk about a migration crisis in economic terms. So I think that what we need to do is to redefine what we mean with forced migration, and we need to redefine our approach to refugees, to asylum seekers, to people in need. We need to start by suggesting legal ways for all the people who need to move. This is the first step to address this.
We have another question by Shannon.
Oh, hi. I had just jumped on kind of late in the session. I'm actually at work, but I'm doing this as well. I just wanted to kind of echo what Dr. Vambakis had said about just the current feeling of, I mean, even individual, just not us specifically or me specifically, I can't personally speak to it, but just like being a couple steps away from being displaced as well.
Tell us where you're at, Sam. Why don't you tell us where you are?
I live in San Antonio, Texas, and I work with the city of San Antonio doing homeless outreach. So I have I would say a good sense of, I mean, people who have been displaced, not from a migrant standpoint, but just people who are consistently displaced, whether that's from being abated from private property or just unable to be placed into different shelters or permanent supportive housing situations, just for a variety of reasons. And on top of that, some of those individuals might be that I've come across might be undocumented or just lacking basic things like identification or driver's license to get them into a more permanent housing situation. So just looking at it from less of like, even from a local level, it's just mind boggling.
We lost you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah. Well,
Oh,
you had a question, or we lost you?
No,
You stopped.
Oh, when did I stop? What was the last thing I said?
You said mind-boggling.
Oh, that was it. I was just I guess just to echo your statement of
Oh, okay. I thought you had a question.
that was more of a
Well, keep up the
statement.
good work, Shannon. Keep up the good work. Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, this is this paradox. I mean, the elephant in the room is the fact that we have this rhetoric that's very nicely packaged in this nice kind of like, liberal movement, freedom of movement. And, Celia actually said it directly. I mean, we can just move around for better jobs or for, and we sort of like, project that kind of prospect on the rest of the world when we read the pages of the New York Times, or some of us who, who have this upward mobility, but we don't understand that the minuscule percentage of that, what it represents in the world, and how many people are just, constantly forced to migrate. And the number that, we received by 2050 was, in the millions of, hundreds of millions of people that are going to be forced to move from just climate, never mind all the other problems that, climate is going to create, the political unrest and everything else that we're going to see. So to what extent then it's an issue of, even to the previous question, to what extent is it like, holding these governments accountable and holding ourselves accountable to the values that we proclaim, because there is a UN Declaration of Human Rights. We do have the right of freedom of movement. That's something that has been established since 1948. This is nothing new. And at the same time, you have this very rigid and increasingly rigid approach of how we deal with the other in our midst, which is fairly, I think it's fairly new historically, right? I mean, the fact that we're not allowing other people to move in the way that, and to the point that Vasilia was making earlier, I think most of the people that came before us came here illegally by the norms of today. When people say, I came in legally, well, that's not true. That's not necessarily true. Unless it was like, after the 1924 Immigration Act here in the United States, which becomes very, very restrictive. Prior to that, people just came in, not necessarily had the same paperwork that requires you, or the same visas that requires you to come in now. So how much of that is a paradox that we are not necessarily addressing, and we're all dealing with like band-aiding a problem?
It is a huge paradox, and you phrased it in a very accurate way. And we see also this incredible paradox when we are trying to deal with a situation of unaccompanied minors who enter as illegal asylum seekers. So you see, now we have a conflict of different perceptions. We have the perception of the proper and the legitimate child. We have the definition of the legitimate asylum seeker, the legitimate person who enters the borders. And then when we have this combination of unaccompanied child that enters the borders illegally, people and the system cannot just deal with this, because they always believe that the child should be with a parent. So why a child travels alone? And then people should enter the borders legally. Why a child without parents enter the borders illegally? So when we deal with this paradox, we just stop treating the unaccompanied child as a child, but we treat it as an illegal immigrant. And then immediately we forget all our promises towards protection of children, our treaties, our agreements. We forget all this and we start treating children as illegal immigrants. So we keep seeing this paradox all the time. And a lot of people ask me what we should do. And we see like what the governments do and how governments approach the issue of migration. And I keep saying that we as people and general population have the power to change this. So as a social psychologist, I would say that we need to understand better what are the perceptions, what are the factors that define perceptions of general population, what are these factors that drive xenophobia, that drive rejection, that drive racism, and also these factors that generate empathy, that generate compassion, that generate solidarity. We saw this in Greece. Greece became an amazing and emblematic example of generosity, even for the past 6 years. And it was very interesting to see, because you mentioned before the census, and we see all the results of the Eurobarometer and all this research. We saw the results that approximately 70% of the Greek population doesn't want to have migrants in the country. But amazingly, 6 out of 10 Greek people provided help to migrants, and they continue providing help. So of course we have our perceptions about migrants and illegal migrants, but in practice, we still help. The question is, for how long this will happen? So I think that we need to focus more on exploring all those drivers, all those factors that drive generosity and racism, and then address these factors. And then we, as the general population, have the power to vote for those people who bring the change based on our core values. So I think that we still have the power to do it, rather than to wait for other people to decide how they're going to address these issues.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, but I think it's also an issue of education, an issue of memory, right? So it's also an issue of this whole idea. I mean, Lesbos. I mean, it's not just a place without any kind of a historical memory about migration both ways and dealing with the pain of that migration. And then you have this diasporic migration as well. So it's those kinds of paradoxes that are they're very real. And I think, you point out to this communitarian values that exist, right? And my next question to you then is, to what extent then those communitarian values are even pushed further with this 2-year social experiment that we have dealing with this pandemic? How much of that communitarian value, what does the pandemic do to the immigration issue?
So, before I even address the impact of the pandemic, I would say that we have seen that the fatigue and the stress on the local communities have played an even more significant role. And I even go back to the point that I raised, that we endorse this discourse about a migration crisis that will end soon. And this is a lie that was not communicated very well. Or I will say it differently, the truth was not communicated very well to the local population. So you give all your help, and you have all your desire to help, because you think that the solution will come very, very soon. But then when the situation continues and continues, and you see that it's 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, now we're on 6th year, and there's no solution. And again, the pressure is being put on the local communities. And now you may all know, all the participants here know, that 5 islands in the Aegean are carrying the burden carrying the responsibility to take care of all migrants. And now we're having closed the centers, we have detention centers, and areas in the islands will be taken so they can have more detention centers. So the local community starts seeing that there was a promise, and this promise was not kept. This is not a short-term phenomenon. There is no solution that is coming. So you keep putting on me the pressure to provide a solution. And then on top of that, we had the pandemic that caused a lot of psychological problems to people. They caused a significant economic problems on local communities. And then on top of everything else, the situation of migration doesn't change. So I feel that this has nothing to do with racism or hostility. It has to do with fatigue. Now, whether this fatigue will turn into hostility and racism, this is a huge question that we need to address.
Yeah, I mean, we have a couple of people who are on this from Samos, which is one of the islands, right? And so if people want to come in and give us their their sense of that argument, you're more than welcome to do so. And it's a very interactive process. And I think just on that point, I mean, I think what's scary for me even more so is, what happened in Evros a couple of years ago in Greece, and the whole idea of, and we've seen that rhetoric here in the United States as far as the caravan discussion. It's almost like, you painting it as a formulated invasion. So it's not even like, you just not only dehumanize, but you also weaponize people in a different way. That becomes even more dangerous, I think, in dealing with people. So,
Dr. Digidiki, just a couple of questions. To what extent do you think the demographic balance between migrants and locals plays a role in the reaction, the response of the local population? Is there like a tipping point where the demographic balance starts to be problematic? And also, to what extent does the socioeconomic condition of the migrants, their educational level, and so on, impact the response by the locals?
I don't think that we can quantify at that point this. I don't think that there is research on this, but what we have seen on the ground and from preliminary research is that if the local population is, or if the migrant population is very different than the local population and there is no proper preparation for integration, then we have a lot of issues. And again, I will use the example of Greece because we have seen it there. Greek population is very homogeneous in terms of religion and history and identity. So now, not only we have a huge number of migrants crossing the borders, but we also have a very heterogeneous group in terms of culture and identity. And when we have small communities and very large number of population, of migrant population that is heterogeneous, then I think that at this point, feelings of threat and to security start appearing. And I think everything has to do, we haven't seen any real threats in practice at the moment, but even the perception of a threat is enough to start changing perceptions. So I think that in this point, we need the proper preparation of the local community, first of all. And second of all, we cannot expect that small communities will have to handle very large number of people. Now, the socioeconomic, again, there is no research on this, but of course, if you feel that the new arrivals will not provide and will not give back to the local community, but instead they will only take from the local community, then yes, this will become a huge factor unless proven otherwise. And we have seen it in the rhetoric that was used mostly in the past years, that all the very well-educated migrants went to Germany or went to France or other European countries, and now we are left without with the people without high levels of education. This is not necessarily true, but still, if they don't give back to the society, then we will start seeing reactions from the local community.
We have a question from a colleague who's on here. So, Sammy, if you want to raise your question, please do so. Otherwise, we can do it for you.
Yeah, I see the chat.
We can hear you, Sammy.
Yeah, I wrote it in the chat. It says no policy, though, would be able to stop the forces and climate among them. And this, I mean, there is no force that will stop this push, of migrants from the south to breach the United States and other wealthy countries' borders, legally or illegally. As a social psychologist, what happens to the human value system when still more people, many millions of them, more float every year across these wealthy countries' borders? What's going to happen?
Yes, this is an important point. Yes, besides, of course, providing safe and legal migration options, of course, we need to try to like change the situation in the origin countries. But of course, when we have climate change, this will be very, very difficult to do. Everything has to do really with how these migrants will be integrated into the society, how fast they will become part of the society, and they will not be treated as something different. And it will. I think that the important point here is whether the society and the economic system can accept them and can make them an important part of the system. Now, if they cannot absorb them anymore, yes, we will have issues in the behavior between the local population and the new arrival. Yes, we may start losing our human values, but I think that we are far away from that yet. I mean, Greece has 120,000 migrants. Is not a large number at this point. And imagine if all the countries collaborated to accept a significant number of migrants, we wouldn't have this problem. The problem starts when we start fighting for resources. Then yes, I think that the instinct of survival will be higher, and we may lose our human values, to be honest. But I think this is hopefully, I hope that we are far away from that.
Thank you.
I think there's one more question in the, Sabrina, do you see it?
Yes. Do you agree with building new closed controlled access centers in Greek islands?
Well, the quick answer is no. I don't really agree with that. Because I think that we keep increasing, if we keeping them separately, we will not facilitate integration. We will not facilitate a connection between the local population and the migrant population. And the only thing that we will manage to do is to create more hostility and more xenophobia. We saw the example in the past when we had open camps, in Lesbos specifically, 2 open camps. People could move in and out. They could go into different like organizations. They could interact with the local population, and they start like adapting in the Greek community. Right now, if you keep them far away and you prevent the interaction with the local population, the only thing that will create is more hostile feelings. But again, we're talking about manageable numbers. If now we're talking again the numbers that we saw in 2015, then of course none the open nor the closed camps will help us. But at the moment, no, I don't think that the solution is to create ghettos and have the migrants in one space and the locals in another space. Imagine that even for those who are eligible for asylum and they stay on these islands for 3 years without getting the opportunity to learn the language, to learn some skills, to interact with the Greek culture. After that, when they are moved to the mainland Greece and it's time for them to integrate, they don't have the skills to integrate, and it takes them more time to figure out how to become a critical and important part of the Greek community. So the only thing we do with this kind of camps is, besides treating vulnerable people in an inhumane way, is to not to help them integrate into the societies.
We solved the immigration issue, I guess.
I hope it was so easy. I mean, I do understand that these sound very good solutions on paper, and when we attempt to implement them, it is extremely difficult. But we can start with small steps. We have seen many countries implementing many of these policies, and they are successful. And on the other hand, we have seen the human costs of like very strict policies. I'm sure that everyone everyone remembers the image of Alan Kurdi on the beach in 2015, the images of children and women trying to swim in the Mediterranean Sea without life jackets, or even worse. I mean, for me, it was shocking to see smugglers throwing children over the wall in the US-Mexican borders. So I think we can just, you know, we have seen the human cost, and we can just start slowly by implementing more humane policies. I do understand the need to protect national sovereignty. I do understand that countries have borders and they need to have their own policies, migration policies, but I do think that everything has to happen from a human rights perspective, that these are people. They are not illegal immigrants. They are not something else. They are people first, and then we have to treat them like this. And of course, to give asylum to those who are eligible for asylum. I'm not saying that we should open the borders and welcome everyone, but we should at least provide to them the opportunity to apply and to consider their asylum claims.
Oh, yeah, let me be a devil's advocate. I mean, why not? I mean, why do we have to premise everything that I believe in national borders? However, I mean, like, why do I have to believe in that when I see what's going on between Poland and Belarus? When I'm a human being and I'm a father, and I see those children in no man's land in Poland and Belarus, and other than numbing my senses and going back to my colleagues' comments, you know, Sammy, about human values, you know, when I see the 15,000 people at the U.S.-Mexico border on the same weekend that Jeff Bezos launches into space, and I see the 15,000 people from Haiti just disappear overnight from a Friday to a Sunday. And I sort of like, you know, I'm comfortably numb, as the song says, you know. I think we have to sort of like, you know, really look into the mirror when it comes to this kind of an issue ourselves, you know, the ones that are fairly comfortable, and really reverse some of that process. Because I think, you know, I agree with Sammy again, you know, and that this is it. And I think you made the point succinctly. I mean, this is not going to change. Climate change is here, whether we're in a critical moment or not. I mean, that's the only debate right now. I think we are in a critical moment. We're in a climate crisis. And I think those are the things that are really in front of us. So I really, when people begin and they say, you know, I have national borders, but it's almost like, you know, we create this automatically, we just sort of like reject it. So like, even if we do open over the borders, you know, like in this hemisphere, we say we open the borders widely, and there's 800 million people that live in this hemisphere, and they can move as they wish. I doubt that everybody wants to move right here in Boston and be in single-digit temperatures. So there will be another equilibrium that's really found. You know, what about that as a concept, I guess?
Well, you know, when I was a first responder and I was seeing all these people like moving, going through the like using the assistance of criminal networks, with all the implications, seeing children being sexually exploited in major European countries just to be able to collect 5 or 6 euros to be able to move somewhere else. Many times I asked myself, would I have done that? And the answer was yes. If my life is being threatened, or if my child's life is being threatened, yes, I would have done it. And I would have left. Now, because to be honest, there is a huge difference between people who are forced to move and people who just want a little, they already have a good life and they want a better life. So in this case, I think that these people don't even have an option. They just want to go somewhere that life is better. And to be honest, when I was talking to people in the Moria camp, and I do believe that the majority of the people here have heard about the Moria camp, there were people who were saying to me that they were much happier in Moria camp despite the perilous living conditions, than being in their own country, where their life was being threatened at any point. So I do believe that people will go anywhere that they can find safety, with whatever terminology people use, or concept people use to define safety. Because for me, safety is something else, for someone else, safety is something else. But yes, people will try to go anywhere just to be able to keep their family safe. So I mean, if we can choose, yes, that would be different. And I mean, we ask people now at the borders of Greece, and they say, yes, I want to go to France because I'm from Africa and I speak French. So yes, I don't want to learn Greek. I want to go to France, or I want to go to Germany. But if they're being, if they get a chance in Greece, they get the chance and they stay in Greece because they just want to be safe.
Great.
You've worked a lot with children, migrant children. Are there certain specific recommendations that, based on your research and experience, you think would significantly improve the condition of children migrants, whether they are traveling with their parents or unaccompanied ones?
So this is a great question, because talking about child migrant population, it's a huge discussion. I mentioned before that a lot of people face difficulties entering this global infrastructure of mobility. Children have even more difficulties accessing this. And I will give you specific examples. When children travel with their parents, they face the same challenges that their parents face. If they cannot get educational visas, they cannot get work visas. So the only way for a child to move, if there is a need to move, is either through humanitarian organizations or through like following their families. So joining where the families are. But these mechanisms also have serious problems, and they are being shrunk year by year, or they face tremendous delays. And I can give you a specific example about reunification with family. We had a case in Greece where a woman from Guinea wanted to bring her kids to Greece, and she had every right to do it. She was a refugee, and she had a lot of legal help. So just to give you a sense of what was happening, Guinea doesn't have a Greek embassy. So the kids had to move to Nigeria to find the Greek embassy there. They found a way to go to Nigeria, and then they realized they didn't have the proper paperwork. So they had to go back to Guinea to find the proper paperwork, if they had the proper paperwork, and then go back to Nigeria to send the paperwork. By the time the paperwork went to Greece, two of the two kids had aged out, meaning that they were not kids anymore, so they were not part of the process. The same thing is happening in Afghanistan. Afghanistan doesn't have a Greek embassy, so they have to go to Pakistan, but the majority of the Afghan kids are in Iraq. So you do understand in Iran, excuse me, so you do understand how difficult the process is. So right now, migrant children don't have any way to access the global infrastructure system of mobility, structure of mobility. So what they do, they just have to move irregularly, and the risks there are even higher. We have chances of human trafficking, of sexual exploitation, of labor exploitation, until they reach one of the rich countries. And then the situation is even worse, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, we treat children as illegal migrants first rather than children. So again, we stranded them in inappropriate camps and inappropriate shelters for prolonged period of times. Most of them were forced to age out inside the camp or a shelter, so then they're being treated as adults rather than children. They are missing school. They don't have access to school. They don't have access to any type of training. So then you have just, adults with no skills, with no future, with no desires. So what is happening the majority of the time? They're being exploited again, either to find more money to move to other country, or because they don't have any other option. So really, I would say that the first step in this case is, again, to treat children, migrant children, as children first. And what we have seen through this migration crisis is that we are faced also with a crisis in child protection. A lot of people think that what is happening to migrant children is a result of a migration crisis. No, it is a crisis of a child protection, and then a migration crisis. So I think we need to keep reminding ourselves that we need to prioritize the status of a child first, rather than that of migrant. And we need to provide to children with the rights that they deserve and they are entitled to.
Mr. Danis, you have a question?
Sorry, you ask me?
Yes.
Yeah. I have so many questions. I don't know where to start. Vasilia, is there any, what's the solution? The problems are going to be there. They were there from the beginning of time. They are there. They will be there. Obviously, human behavior is what it is. And unless we change our DNAs to accept others into our country and home, is like you walk down the street in any city and they're beggars. And unfortunately, whatever you can do, you do. Some of them don't do any, and you extend and give them something. But I know, well, at least I assume and believe that not too many of the givers will take those people home. Mm-hmm. And so how do we resolve a calamity, a problem of human catastrophe? Because I can imagine, and the reasons I can imagine is because I was not a migrant, but I left my home, or my parents took me to Athens at the age of 12, and I was on my own, even though I was in the same and a friendly and the same language country, and I understood. But then I went to the Merchant Marine at the age of 18, and as again, not a migrant, but I understand and I feel very sad and deeply hurt to see this happening. How do we resolve it? And most importantly, I don't think that anyone wants to migrate from their country. They're forced to by the big powers and by the civil wars, and nobody puts a stop to it. But we sell them arms to continue on to push their citizens and the young people to try to find a way of survival. How do we get to that point to stop the migration by improving and fixing the problem at home, rather than trying to support them outside, which is very important, but is almost difficult to manage and accomplish?
You are absolutely right. This is a vicious cycle. We cause the migration and then we try to prevent migration. So yes, one of the measures that we also suggest, besides of course providing safe and legal migration options, is also to try to eliminate the factors that cause this forced migration. This will not, even if we end up in a collaboration where we start doing this, it will still take a lot of time. So it will not happen in 1 year or two. It will take a lot of time, because even if you stop wars, again, the living conditions will be terrible. So you need to start improving the economy. You need to start creating new jobs. So it will take a lot of time. It is one measure in the different measures that are being suggested to stop forced migration. But as I mentioned, it will take a lot of time. But it was also very interesting what you mentioned, that yes, even if we give, it will not necessarily, it doesn't mean that we will take the beggars home. So I think that even in this sense, it requires a collaboration between the general population, the government, the organizations. This is something that we all need to do together. We, as a general population, have to accept these people and commit to help them integrate into the society. The government needs to make sure that they have the proper ways to support themselves. Because of course, if I accept someone, but he doesn't have access to school, he doesn't have a job, he doesn't have ways to earn money, then at some point I will stop helping them and he will stop trying. So I think that at this point, as you mentioned, absolutely we need to try to prevent the reasons for forced migration. Climate change very difficult. But then when we have people moving, we need to make sure to provide legal and safe ways so no one is dying on the way. And then when they enter the country, we all have to try to accept them and to integrate. Imagine yourself if you came here without having any opportunity because the government doesn't give you opportunity, and then the community doesn't give you the opportunity, you would fail. Doesn't matter if you can or not.
Trust me, I feel the pain of those people, but we need a solution.
Absolutely.
The problem we know on a continuous basis since 2001, 9/11, it became a bigger problem than ever before. And somehow the creators of this migration are sitting in their villas, in their homes, in their offices, and here you are trying to convince a small group of people that we as a society need to accept them and give them an opportunity and open our doors. And again, human behavior is very simple. That's not going to happen for a while, and for the same people have to be. Anyway, I think you are absolutely correct, and I wish we could.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. So sorry, I lost everything. Thank you, Dr. Titiki. We are very grateful for this interesting and insightful presentation. I would also like to thank our facilitator, Dr. Yuli, today for leading this great discussion, and thank you to our audience as well for being here and for asking these great questions. Before ending the presentation, I would like to remind everyone that we're going to have another presentation tomorrow at 8 a.m. Boston time and 15 in Athens time with Dr. Ifantis and Dr. Arvintopoulos. They will be discussing Cyprus in the sub-regional energy and security complex in the Eastern Mediterranean. Thanks again for all of you to be here today. We especially thank Dr. Dititiki for all your time. Thank you for this great presentation.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.